Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 13 of New Media Caucus. The Header Footer Gallery presents our monthly podcast. We're so excited to have our guest, Morgan Green, today. I will be your uh, voice of God, helping with the streaming today. My name is Harshini Karunaratne, and on today, joining us, we have our co host, Constanza Salazar and Rene Cepeda. We want to start with kind of introducing a little bit about the Header for the Gallery. So the Header for the Gallery is part of the New Media Caucus and is dedicated to promoting the creative output of our members by situating their work in thoughtfully curated exhibitions that take place across our entire web presence. New Media Caucus is an international nonprofit association formed to promote the development and understanding of new media art. We represent and serve artists, designers, practitioners, historians, theorists, educators, students, and scholars, recognizing new media art to be inherently interdisciplinary, multimodal, and evolving. We support and advance a wide range of inquiry to catalyze further evolution of the field. The New Media Caucus is committed to extending and sustaining the diversity of our community, board, and membership to promote an environment of equality, inclusion, and respect for difference. We prioritize inclusion as an ongoing collaborative process of growth that we continually address both within the caucus and in our field. Now that that's out of the way, I would like to pass the mic, the virtual mic, over to our co-host, Rene Cepeda.
Thank you, Harshini. So first of all, why don't we start with Morgan telling us a little bit about yourself, and then we can move on to the interview proper.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah. Hi, my name is Morgan Green. I wear a lot of different hats as per the New Media Caucus description, very just interdisciplinary. But I'm pretty much always working at the intersection of computer science and art. And I'm usually trying to use the tools that computation has to offer in order to better understand how we make meaning in society. And so often my work deals with language, either directly or indirectly. And I am based in Chicago for now, but I am moving to semi-rural Northwest Pennsylvania to start a position as assistant professor of computer and information science at Allegheny College. So that is my exciting next chapter. Thank you. And yeah, I'm very, very honored and happy to be working with all these lovely people in the New Media Caucus on this show.
Well, first of all, congratulations. That's exciting news. Okay, so before anything else, I wanted to touch on the name of the exhibition. When we're talking about doing the exhibition, one of the things we said is like it's called text fields, right? Like it's a very web-based thing. It's like one of the main things for communication. But one of the things I did is go even further in history to text as its etymology, right? Like it comes from texture, it comes from this weaving thing. I don't know how do you feel about that interpretation? Did you feel that it added to your work, or do you think it was more like just like a nice way to introduce it, or what do you think?
No, I didn't know that until you sent me that statement that you had written that the etymology of text has to do with a fabric. And to me, that was really interesting to me. And I felt very sort of vindicated in the track that I've been on with my work, because I think a lot about the history of computation, which has a lot to do with textiles. And I never noticed that text is in the word textile until I read what you had written about this show. So I think that it actually provides me a really nice framework for understanding how language, computation, and computations like pre-20th century history work together. And it's something I'm looking forward to continuing to think about.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned like the textiles and computation, I totally forgot that some of the earliest like computing things were the looms.
Totally.
That made the tartans, for example. When I was in Scotland, I went to one of those places and they literally code the machines. Like they have these punch cards that have like the way these steam age things do the coating for the texture or the textile. And yeah, it gives you like this feeling of like web code and coding and all these things.
Yeah, it's amazing. If you look at the sort of punch cards from looms from like 1803, they look a lot like the IBM computer punch cards from like 100 years later. It's wild.
Yeah, so I was happy of that, because you gave me this thing text, but it wasn't text,
right?
And I think that's what sent me into this. Well, how do I bring it back to textile? But it's also like a very textured work itself because it's code. So it became like this weaving thing, and I was like, yeah, this kind of works. I don't know, Connie, do you have a question? I know you're jumping.
No, I'm not sure where to start actually. There was I was reading your bio, I read the curatorial statement, I, went into your website, I looked at the works and I did all of that, right? But and I also read, but we'll get to it in a little while, Persephone's sort of review of the exhibition, right, that you did. But first, I want to just start with, I think this was in your bio from your website. It said that we see our devices simultaneously as our lifeless servants and immortal progeny.
Yeah.
And that really struck me. Because not only is there a duality, but there is this tension that we always have, at least, in thinking about technology itself. And it's something I struggle with in my own sort of research, right? Because people think about them as, okay, they're going to take over the world, or, especially AI or something like that. That's what is often said. But also there is this idea that we create machines in our own image, and there's like a whole history behind that. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more about that, and how does that really fit into your own work as well? I know it's a big question, but I was just curious because it was one of the phrases that really struck me as well, and thinking about your work too.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I have to think a second about where to begin. Because this has actually been, in terms of my written research and some of one of the conference presentations I was doing last fall, I've been thinking a lot about how these sort of humanoid machines show up in fiction. And there's this life influences art, influences life thing happening, where I think a lot of very vocal or well-known tech practitioners are taking up some ideas that have primarily come up through fiction.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's this whole robot, which is a word that comes from the Czech robos, which has to do with forced labor, which has to do with slavery. So there's always this, when we use the word robot, even though it has, like, the first time it was used, it was in Karl Čapek's play
Rossum.
Yes, there we go. Rossum's Universal Robots. Thank you, Rene.
Yes.
Or RUR for short, right? And the robots described in that play were actually a little more like the replicants in Blade Runner. They were these sort of biological organisms that were made out of like sort of a bio powder clay or something like that. I don't remember the details. And so the idea was they were like biologically made of many of the same materials as human beings, but they didn't have consciousness. However, they had all of the sort of physiological capacities of humans. And then this question comes into play, whether or not this absence of consciousness is real, given how human these creatures seem to be. And the idea of a robot as a mechanical thing came not a lot later, but a little bit later, that it actually showed up in other works by the same playwright. So I'm going way back with that, but this was like in the 1920s. And I think it's really important to consider this impetus of the idea of a humanoid machine as having a direct relationship to ideas about slavery, that's connected to an American history of slavery, because that history is so primary and within the history of slavery in general, because it was so protracted, because it was so recent, and because it was so horrifying. And the way we think about it's a lot, it's a whole like bucket of stuff. But I think that the main problem that continues to show up in the way we think about this idea of a robot in fiction today, and also the way we continue to think about the possibility of machine sentience as a real thing, which is heavily contested among experts who are much better versed in the subject than I am. Like, I don't know whether or not a machine could ever be able to feel. I read stuff about it, and it seems like it's very much up for debate. Again, people who know more than I do land on different sides of this question. But what I'm more interested in, or what I feel more capable of grappling with, is how we ask the question and the implications of that way of asking it, if that makes sense. So going back to what I was saying before about Karl Kapek and this idea of the robot in fiction, it's always like, there are all of these plays, and this is something that I've been speaking about and that I've been working on writing about. There are all of these plays and films and books where there is a humanoid machine, like a somewhat recent example. I think this is 10 years ago now, but the movie Her, or the movie Ex Machina, there's this machine, and this machine does a really good job of acting human, or a pretty good job of acting human. And it seems like there's this pivotal question in the narrative: can this machine actually feel or not? Is it an illusion, or is it a real thing? There's this really pivotal question, and it seems like that's what the question is. But if you actually look at what drives the drama of, in the case of those two examples, Ex Machina and Her, the question that actually drives the plot of the movie is not whether the machine can feel, it's whether this white dude thinks that the machine can feel. And I think that distinction is huge in the way we think about this stuff, both in fiction and these days in reality. And that's super visible in this Blake Lemoine thing that happened like a year ago, where this Google engineer was fired for saying that this language model was sentient. It's super visible in the way that Elon Musk is talking about the possibility of a machine revolt. And that anxiety he has, I think, is really tied to a really racialized panic about a potential revolt by enslaved people. So all of this stuff, it's real complex. And I'm unable to articulate it any faster, I think, than I just did at this point. But I think it shows up everywhere. And I'm kind of interested in breaking down, like, I don't use machine learning or anything that complicated so far in my work. The models I use in order to create work are super simple. None of them would take me more than 2 minutes to explain. And I think that's important because it shows us the components of what's going on when we talk about an intelligent machine. Because in the same way as, like, a flock of birds doing very simple things create a very complex system, these more simple components of software that I write, these are the same components that make up a more complicated system, like a machine learning system, like a ChatGPT. So I'm interested in work where that stuff is a little more transparent. I'm interested in making work where that stuff is a little more transparent, because I think it helps us see the building blocks of these things that are supposed to be so kind of super whatever, super beyond our expectations or understanding.
I think just to follow up on it, I thank you so much for that response. And I know it was a very, one of the first questions, right? It was a little tricky, but yeah, no, but I was thinking it's also, because I was thinking back actually on your work at the Ammerman too, and the way that you sort of did this performance with this machine, if you want to call it that, right? But it's also was a very interesting way of putting back the human into the performance piece too. And just thinking about what you were saying about using these particular components, it also helps us to have transparency, like you said, but also it helps us to do away with all that complexity that a lot of not only machines, but also like the tech companies actually hide behind. When we don't have full transparency, it makes it a lot more difficult for people, even the layperson, to ask, why are you doing this, right? For what purpose? It's difficult to resist back, right? Is I guess what I'm trying to say. So I think the human component or the aspect of it is really important as well. in that regard, and which is something that I really appreciated about your work. But we'll talk about that in just a sec because I have more questions, of course. But Renee, I don't know if you wanted to go ahead with another one.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot because there's like the whole thing about what is a robot, what is an android, what's a cyborg, and how really the distinction's starting to merge. But I kind of want to pull it back into the actual website because
Yeah.
when we designed it, one of the things is we really didn't have a budget for like the pizzazz of the website, right? But I think it actually was better because it pulls you back to this very early age of the web when you would literally see like the directories in the web page, right? You remember? I don't know if you remember that. So the website itself became an evidence of the working parts of a website, right? So I think that kind of resonates with the work because in your works, you're using these building blocks to assemble the work, like all the like, yeah, it's all of them. Right? Well, no, some of them work on themselves, but in general, like the works, you have some level of input as a participant of the work.
Yeah.
And you choose where, for example, what's the name of the one with the prisms?
That's called text field, singular.
Oh, that one is text field, right?
Yeah.
So in text field, you build these blocks. They're generated by code. They're not GIFs or JPEGs or anything.
Yeah.
And it's this evidence of how the web is built in itself. And I found that really, really interesting. But the question, I guess, was that your intention, or was I reading too much into it?
That it had something to do with sort of like Web 1.0 or like seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really thinking about that. I was thinking a little bit. I mean, so my sister, I have a twin sister, and she is, the closest person to me in my life, and she sees a lot of the things I do before anybody else does. So I was showing her this piece in early iteration, and she was like, "It's like kid pics." And I don't know, do you all remember kid pics?
Very barely.
Very, very okay. There's actually like an online. You don't know, or you do know? You don't know. Okay, it's like, oh shoot, I should have. There is like an online version of it now. I can't remember where you can find it, but I don't think it would take too long with Google. But it's basically this children's drawing program from the 1990s, and if you grew up in that time, and had like your first family computer in the mid or late 90s, or you had your first experience with a computer in grade school, you probably would have drawn something with kid pics. And it's a drawing program like Microsoft Paint, like the kind, but it also has some funky things about it. Like
that was fun.
Yeah, it was really fun. There were like fun sound effects and animated paint, and there were like stamps you could use that had sort of a recursive or fractal quality. Like I think you could draw a tree and it would keep growing more branches if you like held the mouse down and stuff like that. Though it was a drawing program where you had a lot of agency over the image, but at the same time, there was something coming from the people who made kid pics. They had like a graphical. They kind of limited your style ability, like your style flexibility with it, but it meant that there was like kind of a vision for how all of these children's drawings would come out that was unified, but it still gave kids using the program quite a bit of agency. So I was thinking about that, and just sort of like the amount of freedom you can have just by being able to control where a stamp shows up on the canvas, even if you don't control exactly what the stamp looks like. Just having this limited amount of control and what you can create with that. And I feel like that really does speak to what it was like to operate a computer earlier on, in the era of consumer level computation. Like you didn't have 1,000 different things you could do, and in the same way you were more liberated because you weren't being surveilled and controlled in quite the same way as you are now. So yeah, I would say absolutely. I was thinking about those earlier aesthetics, and I was kind of trying to I was kind of trying to like collapse a couple decades in one screen. I'm not sure how successful I was at that, but
I think it was successful. Like, it really feels like this trip through various stages of the web. And I just loaded the like pictures of kid pics, and it's like, yeah, like all the memories. Yes, I remember spending so much time on that thing and playing with all the buckets and how the paint would drip and all that stuff.
Yeah, and there was like this sound. It was really fun. And my sister was like, it's like kid pics, and I was like, but it's art. And she was like, it's a compliment. And now I appreciate it as that. Thank you. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. That's the beauty of kid pics. It's also very GeoCities like it has that feel of that early web stuff. I mean, kid pics. When your website's infinitely more put together than a GeoCities website.
Yeah, I tried to bring some design to it. Well, still to the simplicity, but it's a little. I'm trying to balance some stuff.
Yeah, but yeah, no, it's. I think it's one of those works that really captures you, and I think you can see that because even in like the review that we read that was made about your work, that's the one people centered on. Not that the other ones are weak. It's just that this one, text field, is so powerful visually, and it has this thing that triggers like some primal, like, desire to put the things and try to make more compositions, even though it's just moving like 3 variables. Is it 3 or 4? I can't remember.
Yeah, as many as you want. But yeah.
But it was really, really interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying thank you.
I know Harshini, you want to jump in because I know you have questions as well.
No, what I was thinking is actually when you were also talking about, movies like Her and Ex Machina, where we tend to impose, our own biases, and we tend to reflect an AI or an artificial being or some sort of robot as having human emotion. It also reminded me of, the first instance of an AI chatbot, which was Eliza, and Eliza would just, regurgitate, would just reflect back exactly what you're saying. But people would assume that, it was actually listening to you, which maybe is more a reflection of how lonely people were seeing, maybe that people were feeling, right? Maybe there's not much of a difference between loneliness in a post-2020 era and loneliness in the 1960s. But it's interesting that there's always this kind of desire to impose or reflect back or really find some sense of humanity within these artificial creations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the Eliza example is a really good example. If I'm remembering, you would say something like, I'm sad about my cat. And then Eliza would just be like, are you sad about your cat? Or something like that.
She had a therapist script attached to her as well, which is really interesting, which was later developed afterwards with other chatbots that emerged after some time too, which is really fascinating that the first presumably chatbot was a therapist chatbot, right?
Yeah. And that was in the 1950s,
sorry.
right? Or late 40s?
1960s.
Oh, 1960s. Okay.
Have you heard of Replica?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so you're gonna have fun with this. Replica is an app on your iPhone, okay, and it's an AI, okay. It's called the virtual AI friend. That's how it's. I don't know. It's not gonna.
It's blurred.
Hold on, let me try and unblur this.
Oh yes, I've heard of this.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So this thing, it's like free to try. Well, it's not free to try. It's free to use until you want to get sexy with it. I'm not kidding. You have to unlock a subscription service for it to have the romantic options unlocked. And and you design this. I don't want to say person, but I also don't want to say this thing. This avatar. Yeah. So. Yeah, this digital being, and you give it a personality. Like you choose, like, oh well, it should be a little gothy, or it should be a little whatever. And you give it these traits, but then it starts talking to you and it starts learning and remembers things about you. And it's like Eliza, like times 1,000, right? And people form attachments to this, like really strong attachments. So when they started removing some of the more risque, sexy options, people literally rioted because they were so attached to this person. And well, because they saw it as a person, they're like, you would see the things is like, she won't talk to me the same way. What have you done to her personality? She's no longer the person I used to. But they use these words like, she's not the person I used to know, right? So it kind of speaks to this attachment that like humans don't seem to need the factor of humanity for things to become too attached to something. You can put googly eyes on a Roomba and people will become attached to it.
Yeah, I would totally become attached.
Yeah, no, definitely. My mom gets upset at her Roomba when she gets stuck. It's like she talks to it like if it was like a dog. It's like, why did you get stuck? Or why are you doing here? Like, I didn't send you here. Things like that. It's like, I mean, she's aware it's a vacuum cleaner, right? Like, it's not like she's demented, but she's like, she humanizes it. Well, or gives it a personality and a life, and like she thinks it has a personality and that it does things just to mess around sometimes. I don't know. So yeah, so all that talk about Eliza and all that kind of sent me into thinking about these things, about how easy it is to, you know, anthropomorphize. But it's not anthropomorphizing. It's more like, I don't know how to say it, like humanize? Embody it, like humanize, I guess. Humanize, well, it's just no, because you don't humanize a dog, but you can become attached to the creature.
Sure.
And talk to it, even though you know it won't talk back to you or won't feel the same ways that you perceive it feels. But to give it feelings, to give it like a soul, I guess.
This is a very analog example, but I was staying with a friend in London this weekend, and he had a vacuum cleaner called Charles, you know, and it's from like the Henry Hoover company, you know. So there's a vacuum cleaner called Henry, and it has a face, and like Charles also is like the bigger version, and it has a face. And I was like looking up, why does it have a face? You know, like why am I like suddenly emotionally attached to this vacuum cleaner? And it was, you know, it's kind of started off as a joke, but then eventually it was like designed to have a face so that the late night cleaners wouldn't feel lonely, you know.
Oh,
Which is, but let me tell you, it's kind of creepy. Okay, it's wide-eyed, so I don't know if it's
Henry
helps.
It's cute. I had a Henry in my flat in the UK. It's kind of cute. But yeah, it's weird seeing a vacuum cleaner with an eye. But also, Harshini's not mentioning this. The eyes are above where the hose goes in. So it's kind of like it has like a long trunk like an elephant, and it's big eyes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an experience. I don't know. Connie, you have another question?
Yeah. So to bring it back, because we were talking about vacuum cleaners, which is great. I wanted to talk about the interactivity aspect of the work as well, but also there are a couple of things that are sort of coming together, and it's the fact that, as it says in the curatorial statement, right, it doesn't have an explicit goal, which is something that really drew me into your work, actually, because as a person that studies, you know, digital and technologies and all of that, and really reflects upon society and the way that technology is moving forward, right? I always ask the questions: forward for whom? Progress for whom? Innovation for whom? And under what conditions? And who is being left out? And all of these different things that many people actually don't consider or fail to consider, right? And especially if they are in these industries. The point is, most of technology, when I ask this question to my students, like, what is technology? They said, oh, it's a tool, right? Or it's such and such, but it has a goal, right? It has an explicit end to that, what it's trying to do. So what I found more refreshing about the work is that it doesn't have an explicit goal. And within that, there is this element of play that we sort of touched a little bit upon in an earlier question. And it got me thinking about how do we make meaning with play in works like yours as well, right? And that got me thinking because I work in a very weird way. I get a whole these associations, mind maps, right? Um, but if we make meaning and that's sort of a temporal dimension, right? That it ceases to exist at some point. But in your work, it's also a spatial relationship or like dimension to it too, which I found really interesting because you're actively creating all these different elements or components, right? Depending on which one you're working on, right? So I guess I wanted to know if you can speak a little bit more to this aspect of play, and temporality and dimension and all that as well, and how that influenced your meaning making, right?
Yeah, definitely. Would it be possible to, Harshini, to pull up the website? Because I think it might help to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the text field one is a good, or the text field. Um, yeah, and you can, if you just want to mess around with it. Okay, yeah, so there's this. Yeah, thank you. This is great. Okay, so yeah, it's like the way this program works is you're like drawing using these prisms, but there's a lot of you can change the way the prisms look. And there's also some randomness, like the way they show up when you initially load the screen. Is partly driven by a random or a pseudo-random number generator. So right now it's like you're basically the prism creates a window into this photograph I took of some trees in Meadville where I'm moving in a couple months. And yeah, if you want to try some buttons, yeah. And so sometimes there you can see the outline of the prism, or you can choose to take it away. You can add this rainbow component. Yeah. And I've been working on these prisms for a while, and I'm trying to think about a few things with them. But definitely, I think of them as playful. I thought it was really fun to be able to create this prism and fill it with a rainbow if you want to, or fill it with a photograph if you want to. And in the time when I was coding this, it felt very playful because there were certain problems that I was trying to solve, and then new images came out of that, even when I didn't quite solve the problem that I had first set out to solve. And yeah, it just felt like building blocks or being a child or playing with a toy. And I was interested in how I could include color, how I could play with the inclusion of color. But I was also from the outset, because a lot of these other things came later, I was interested in breaking space. And a lot of artists have figured out different ways to sort of break the logic of physical space within a painting. MC Escher is an obvious example. But I wanted to see if I could automate that. And if you look at the way these sort of clusters of cubes with the outlines on them come together, like I figured out a way to programmatically make it so that at some point they break the logic of physical space, although sometimes you have to look carefully in order to see that. And I'm interested in finding new ways to do it other than the way I did it here, which was basically just to kind of how do I explain this? Just having different, like each prism has like 6 possible facets, but if you vary which facets show up on different prisms, then it creates this broken space illusion. So if you like only have like 2 or 3 facets show up and they change, but you cluster them as if they're in the same physical space, then at some point forward for one is back for another, and there's no way of reconciling that with the conventional physics through which we understand our world. Okay, so I was interested in doing that, and then I was interested in finding all these other ways to sort of layer contradictions in space. So yeah, here you see like the prisms are filled with rainbows, and you can have the rainbow on its own, or you can, like there's a bunch of different options, and you kind of have to play with it in order to figure out. Like I put some clues as to what the different buttons do, but you can't really know unless you try. But yeah, I was basically interested, like Constanza, a lot of what you're saying really resonates with what I was trying to do here, because I think systems of signification are part of being human. Like I've actually been learning some new stuff about linguistics and the psychology of language. And apparently a lot of theorists believe that language is more like an organ than a technology, or more like an organ than a tool. Like it's so inevitable with neurotypical people that you can think of it as part of our embodiment almost. And that's been a really interesting sort of curveball in how I've been thinking about these things. But I do think that, so language is innate in a way. It's like part of our body in a way. And at the same time, it is a tool of both control and liberation. So I was trying to think about that with these cubes, and I was thinking about cubes that break space, cubes that break language, or prisms that break space and language. And I was thinking about how to layer kind of different sort of physical spaces within one image, and I'm not sure exactly where it breaks and where it comes together. And I was also very interested in giving the user agency over it, partly so I could see how other people would, like I wouldn't create the same image that Harshini is creating right now, even though we would be using the same tools and like a pretty limited set of tools and images that I put out here. But yeah, so I think it's a lot of fun to break language. And I also think it is a radical thing to do. I think there's a lot of transformative potential in breaking language. And I kind of am also very interested in, this is a linguistics concept too, I'm very interested in the reality that no two people speak the same language. So I was trying to figure out a way to have kind of multiple languages of space coexist on one plane. Thank you for doing all these different images. This is really great. Yeah, thinking about multiple languages as multiple ways of rendering and understanding space, multiple sort of physical laws, and that comes with the way the clusters of prisms break each other, and also the rainbows versus the photographs, the 2D versus 3-dimensional imagery. And I think a lot of painters engage with these same questions. Like I think you see a lot of that in like Julie Marich's work, for example, and she was very influential. And the way that I was thinking about this work and the colors involved, or like Tamari Dodge. I think a lot of painters think about these same questions, but I was interested in bringing it to the browser as a way of giving people a different kind of access to it, and also a different kind of involvement with it. And I hope that it's fun, but I also hope that it's like creates some sort of confusion of boundaries, and helps people maybe see, or at least helps me see, a way into entering a language that is not your own, and see that it's possible to coexist with contradiction.
So you just mentioned something about a language that's not your own. I don't know if you're familiar with Blendy.
I don't think so. So
Blendy is a blender, an austerizer, but its creator, I just lost her name. But this person created this blender with a little like computer in it, and it replies to you. So if you go to the blender, you go, the blender will start blending, but at the speed. So if you go, it'll start blending really fast. If you go, it'll start blending at a slower pace. So what it does is that it inverts the relationship of language between human and machine. Basically, generally, like every time you interact with a computer or any technology, in fact, you speak in a human language, and the machine has to interpret and convert that into binary code that it can use to do whatever you want it to do, right? Like when you use your computer, you click on an icon, and that icon looks like a camera, and that opens up with Zoom, right? Or you click on a little notepad, and and it opens a thing where you type. Or you type an instruction, even if you're at a very basic level, if you're working at, say, the terminal, you go c dot dash dash dir slash page or whatever. It's still human language. And then the computer has to take those commands, interpret them, and turn them into binary code that it can use. However, with Blendy, what happens is that the human is having to use the language of the blender, right? So you're communicating through the language of the thing. You're not using the dials to switch it from, let's say, frappe to super fast or whatever. So that makes us aware that the computer itself has its own language, and that humans don't learn the language of the machine, right? And that's a really nice inversion of language that I think is not explored as often, but at the same time, it's nice to see that in a way you're continuing that like trajectory. Can't say it. Trajectory. Thank you. Trajectory of inverting the language of the machine and the human, right? At least that's how I feel it went. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I think thank you for telling me about that. Is this like a blender you can buy, or is it like an art?
No. It's an artwork. It's Kelly Dobson. That's the name of the artist. And yeah, it just came back to me. Yeah, it was in a museum, and you would walk by, and it would be sitting there, and all of a sudden, randomly, would start going because it would want to initiate a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So the blender would randomly start blending, but you could also engage with it and be like, and it would start blending on its own, matching you.
I thought it was probably an art. It would be so cool if you could make your smoothies that way.
Can you imagine? Oh, you would go sore by the time you had your smoothie, though.
Yeah, because you would have to like do it the whole. You'd have to be like the whole time.
Yeah, exactly, like the whole time until. It would be funny, but yeah, and it's such a simple thing. It doesn't really have an AI. It's more like just circuitry and like a sensor.
Yeah, it's just about probably volume and like a certain I don't know, frequency, something like that. Yeah, I'm not super. I don't understand the physics of sound very well, but yeah.
It feels like that.
I think there is totally an element. Could we show the every word piece?
Teal wheel seal real. Sayas face deus pays sayas highs nice. Vis. Fort root font fort sud root boot flot loot fort root hoot boot fort good toot fost font moot dud nud coot.
It's so satisfying when it's like fort root fort.
Yeah, I like how fast the machine voice can read. I actually do a live performance that where the text is sort of related to this text or closely related to this text, and I try to read that quickly, but I can get close, but I can't quite do it. But yeah, so this is a poetry generator where the relationship between the words and the way they're sequenced has only to do with aspects of the words, like relationships between the words that the computer can see if you don't give it any knowledge of grammar or any knowledge of meaning of content of definition. So again, it's a model that would be really easy to explain, although it is like kind of an accident the way this came out, in that like you weren't ever, the way I wrote this program, I was just trying to, I was basically trying to make a rhyming dictionary, but that's not phonic. That just has to do with visual rhymes that have to do with words that start with the same letter and end with different letters. And then I had some variations on that. And then I accidentally nested a for loop or something like that. So I ended up getting all this repetition. So it ended up having this sort of accidental poetic aspect to it, where there's more of a rhythm because words are repeated more than once. So yeah, you get this like, and then these random, like, honestly, I don't know exactly what I did. So I said I could explain all my models, but I actually can't explain this one totally because it was a mistake. And I don't know where the code is that I wrote to generate it. I think I'll be able to find it if I really need to, but anywho, I think it's somewhere in some folder, in a folder. But yeah, you can see it like the computer is only grouping these words together and sequencing them based on letter sequence relationships that are similar among them. And so I think that in terms of, what are we talking about, kind of like exposing like the computer's language, it's doing a bit of that.
Yeah.
Because the computer, even if you tell it what a word means, John Searle would argue that it doesn't know. And that it's really just an imitative system, and that you can't presume content within that system or subjectivity behind it, that you can't presume a point of view just because it's able to imitate a human like sequence of words. I don't know, there's like the whole like John Searle versus Ray Kurzweil debate. I don't really have a dog in that fight, or I would like to pretend that I don't anyway. But I am interested in things that the computer very transparently can understand, such as, does this word have the same last 5 letters as this other word? Which like the computer can absolutely answer that question. And so you see that in the outputs of this particular algorithm. And so I am interested in sort of exposing computer language, but I'm also interested in the way that meaning comes out of that, or that we put meaning into that, which goes back to the Eliza example that we were talking about earlier, where this very early example of a chatbot that just reframes things that you say in the form of a question and uses some therapeutic language. You were saying, Constanza, right? The way that can feel like a very like a conversation that is actually full of meaning and content and compassion, possibly. And here it's like some people end up finding meaning in this and some people don't. So like Persephone, in the review that they wrote of this particular work, they found it very frustrating how what's the word I'm looking for? Like destitute of meaning these outputs are, but other people see them and they don't believe me that it's random. They like, especially when I do it as a vocal performance, they're like, how much did you edit that? How much did you change what the computer said? How much did you this or that? And I'm not gonna like, when I'm doing the performance version, sometimes I riff on it a little bit, but it is very much rooted in what the computer generates. And I find meaning in it all the time. The text that this comes from is like hundreds of pages long. And all this program is doing is really excerpting this much longer text. That can't, so it's a finite text actually. It's not like an infinitely generating text that comes out of this accidental program I wrote. But it's about 800 pages long. So the likelihood that you would ever generate the same poem twice within this system is pretty low. Could happen, it could totally happen. You'll definitely, if you play with it for long enough, you'll definitely see some recursion in the content.
Sorry.
I think this one is fun, so I might just play it for our audience now.
Great.
Shown. Dominates. Dun nun tone dun nun bone tone nun zone lone cone bone dun one lone tone pone one nun zone bone son joan dun hone son cone ioni. Causer casser casper. Convert concert Colbert covert coronet crochet concert.
It starts very like dramatic because I assume like because it's like entering into the next paragraph, it takes a pause. So it starts very like shown. Dominates. Don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing about like this. I think this piece is really funny, and I think it has
Totally.
like, to me, I read irony in it, like even in the sort of pauses and emphasis that you're describing. And then to be like shown and then dominates. Like if I was going, if you gave me that in like a literature class, I'd be like, oh well, what's visible to you is what's going to be dominant in your psyche, and so people can control you with UX design, and they can get you to press the button that says buy this thing, whatever. Like I can, like it's very easy to impose meaning on something. And again, like the way this program works is it was just like, let's group these words based on these similarities that don't have to do with anything except for how many letters in common do these words have. And then I think I incorporated like a homonym dictionary. And then for some reason, like I broke the code a little bit and it ended up having some words by themselves on one line. I don't know why. I'm not that interested in finding out because I think that would like ruined the mystery for me, but it's nothing complicated. Whatever it is that made it do that is very fucking simple and also a mistake. So yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I don't.
You had a question, Rene.
I do have a question. Well, first of all, there's like a lot of art history attached to this piece, I think. I don't know if you're familiar with Ursonante by Kurt Schwitter.
Mm-mm.
Is it Kurt Schwitter? Yeah. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Have you?
I don't think so. There's certainly like concrete poets and like early conceptual art movement stuff that I think of when I think about this piece, but I don't know. Yeah, tell me about that piece.
So basically, what it's completely different, but it has this cadence and things. So Kurt Schwitter, what he did in Ursonante is he created this poem without any words, but it follows every single rule of poetry itself. So he just uses sounds that sound like language, right? So it's like bin sim sandam sum shoot da dum ba dam ba, right? So he's playing with language and how you can make something sound like a language without it actually being a language. But at the same time, people are assigning meaning. Like if you don't know, you try to assign meaning. Like you're saying like, oh, well, he's speaking in such and such language or something like that. But in fact, what he was doing was he was experimenting with the structure of poems and the
rhythm,
and the rhythm and everything. So when your program reads, it has this feeling of like Ursonante, and it's really interesting. And the other thing is it also pulls me back to these automatic writing experiments and these poems that where whatever artists would cut words out of magazines and put them in a bag and then pull the words independently. And it feels a little bit like that. It's a similar process. And we did that in class with my students. It's apparently one of the best classes I've ever given. I don't know why, but they really enjoyed that one. And the poems that come out, like, they're like, I'm not choosing like the word, like they're like, I'm not choosing the words, but it's coming out as things with meaning. Like they find deeper meaning in these poems. And it's funny because one of the things that I told them is do not bring texts about art to chop up. So they were using like medical texts and things like that. And it ended up coming into these very poetic things. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that feeling in your work. And not just in this one, but in general, it's a very dada. I can't pronounce it. Connie's gonna kill me. Vibe to it.
Please don't. No.
But I don't know. Is that any of that like part of your work, or is this just like a happy coincidence that it resembles these histories of language and art?
I would say like I've been aware of those histories. I mean, yeah, I like honestly like the first show in high school. I went to high school in the DC area, and you could go to the National Gallery for free. And there was this Dada retrospective there. I was like 15, I think. There was just like a very comprehensive Dada exhibition. And that was like my first encounter with, I know it's like predates the conceptual art movement, but I think I would still call it my first like profound encounter with conceptual art, even though it's pre-conceptual conceptual art, I guess. So yeah, I would say that kind of thinking has been influential to me in ways that I can't totally track because it's just kind of formative in terms of I went to that show every weekend that it was open. I was so into it. I was like this like dorky 15-year-old, and I was like, this is like, I can't even, it was just so transformative for me. So I would say, yes, that stuff is influential. But I don't know that I am the best person to, I think hearing you recount that influence, I'm like, oh yeah, that's probably part of where I'm getting this from. But I'm not necessarily conscious of it while I'm making the work.
I mean, and it's not like it's derivative. It's just very like it has the spirit.
And it's part of the
highlight
history,
that.
which is important.
Yeah, it's part of history.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it's like
it's not. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. It's also like in the same data movement, like there were some very early images of automata. I think before the word robot had even entered into language, there are these images of automata that were very uncanny, and had to do with World War I and had to do with these. So yeah, I absolutely consider myself as part of that history, and I want to be part of that history. And I would like to think that I am, part of the process where it's continuing to unfold. But yeah, I that's a compliment. So thank you.
I guess what I wanted to ask as well, now that we're finalizing our show, right? Is also what other works do you have planned for now? And what makes you excited about producing them? Any things that you're working on right now or will be in the future?
Yeah, definitely. So I have two kind of primary projects that I'm thinking about now. One is an essay where I talk about the way that these ideas of robot consciousness are tied to a racialized history, and to a queer history, and how that's like unfolding, like starting with Catholic, like we talked about, and then into the present day and into the future, and like thinking about also some sort of counter examples of what's being done there, especially Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer, something I'm thinking about a lot.
Have books for you.
So that is what I'm working on writing right now. And then in terms of visual art, a lot of my my main starter project for the new job that I'm doing is going to be extending on. So you talked a little bit about the painting machine that I showed at Ammerman, where we all met last November.
Yeah.
I am hoping to grow that machine and to like the whole idea of a drawing or painting machine that has like an embodied human component, meaning like my body is part of the hardware. That's something I want to continue to develop, and hopefully kind of have these like room-sized machines where my whole body is involved, in a way that like harkens back to an IBM computer that fills a room. So
that sounds really cool.
Yeah, that's gonna. So they're both kind of long haul projects, and I'm not sure when I'll have something to show for it. But I'll have some other work that shows in the meantime. But those are
Remind me to share with you later something. There's this robotic arms that you can attach to your back, and it's like 6 arms, and you can control them with your mind alongside your.
Oh my gosh! Yes, please show me that. That sounds amazing.
That's how you become a Spider-Man villain. What are you talking about?
I don't see the problem there.
What is it, like Dr. Octopus or something?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I failed to see the problem there. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting machine. Like they developed them in Japan, of course, and they're meant to be like used for arts as well. So it's a really interesting like development they're doing there with those things. So maybe you'll find it interesting. Yeah. And again, my brain just jumps to equivalencies and like similarities, and it's like, oh, very Sturlac in a way. Again.
Oh, but, yes.
Yes.
But in a different way, in a very different
But a totally different way. Like, yeah, of course. Like, and this is something that people like need to understand is like you can draw inspiration from an artist and like some of like the things they do, but as long as you're not doing like Sturlac 2.0, you're fine. And I think your work is independent, it's creative, and it's totally different. It's just me seeing like similarities with other things that exist.
Yeah, and that's part of yeah. And I think we're all making art in conversation with other art.
Exactly. That's
what's important. Yeah. Always in conversation, placing tension where you need to place tension, right? Yeah, that I love your work and it's fantastic. And I hope you continue creating more and showing us as well in the future. So.
No, thank you so much. That means a lot to hear that. It was really fun. It was really fun to talking to all of you and seeing you again for the first time in a little bit.
Yes.
We've loved having you. I just want to like let our audience, our listeners know that Morgan's work is still up online on New Media Caucus, so you can go to the website and check it out.
Yeah,
Please do.
definitely. It's gonna be until like mid-July, I think, and then it's Harshini's show.
I have a
Oh,
show.
awesome. Okay.
Oh yes, I have a show.
Yeah, you should promote it, and you should promote
Yeah,
the
plug
call
your
if it's still
show.
time.
Yes, there is an open call for screen-based works with a focus on light. So do check it out. You can check out my Instagram at harshinijk_ for more details. Morgan, where should people follow you? How can we follow what you're doing and what you're up to and check out more of your work?
Thank you for that. Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at howshekilledit. And then my website is also howshekilledit.com. But yeah, pretty much anything major I will post on Instagram at howshekilledit.
Amazing.
Perfect.
Don't miss it. So with that, I think we're gonna call it a day. Thank you so much, Morgan, for taking the time to come and have this delightful chat with all of us. I want to thank Connie for her questions, Harshini for her questions and all. And finally, I want to remind everybody, we do an episode every month. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.